The dust on Ruth Thatcher's boots was 3 states thick, and she had exactly $4.17 left to her name when she walked through the gate of the Cooper Ranch outside of Laramie, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1882. She had not planned to stop here. She had not planned much of anything since the night 6 months ago when her husband's debts had caught up to him in the most permanent way possible, leaving her with a mortgaged house in Missouri, a name that had become associated with failure, and a hunger she refused to let show on her face. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman, with dark copper hair that she kept pinned severely beneath a hat that had seen better years, and brown eyes that people tended to remember long after they forgot the rest of her. She was not the kind of woman who asked for help easily, but she was practical, and she was nearly out of money, and the sign she had seen posted on the general store wall in town 3 days ago had been specific in a way that gave her hope. The sign had read, "Help wanted at Cooper Ranch. Cook and housekeeper. Serious applicants only. No drifters. Inquire with Foreman Hayes at the main gate." She had memorized it because she had nothing to memorize it with, no paper and no pencil, only a mind sharpened by necessity. She had ridden the last 40 miles on a borrowed horse from a woman in Laramie who had taken pity on her for one night and one night only, and that horse was now standing at the hitching post near the gate looking as tired as Ruth felt. The ranch was larger than she had expected. Rolling grassland spread in every direction, broken by a creek to the east that caught the morning light like hammered copper. The main house was a 2-story structure of whitewashed wood, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and even from 50 yards away, she could see that it needed attention, paint peeling at the corners, a shutter hanging crooked at the upstairs window, a porch step that had clearly rotted through and been stepped around so many times that the dirt beside it was worn to a groove. The bunkhouse sat 200 feet to the left, and beyond it were the stables and a series of corrals where horses moved with the loose, easy elegance of well-tended animals. Whatever else had been neglected on this ranch, the horses had not been. A lean man with a sun-cracked face and silver temples was walking toward her from the direction of the corrals, and she knew before he spoke that this was the foreman. "You hear about the position?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance from her and tipping his hat briefly. This was Tom Hayes, and he had the careful eyes of a man who had been disappointed by applicants before. "I am," Ruth said. "My name is Ruth Thatcher. I cooked for a household of 9 in Missouri for 4 years. I can manage a larder. I know how to put up preserves. I can sew. I can manage accounts if needed, and I am not the kind of woman who leaves a job half done." Tom Hayes studied her for a moment. His gaze was not unkind, only thorough. "You traveling alone?" "I am. Long way from Missouri." "Yes," she said, and did not elaborate because the details of how she had come to be standing in front of a stranger's gate asking for work were no one's business but her own. Hayes scratched the back of his neck. "The position pays $12 a month, room and board included. You'd have a room in the main house, separate from the hands. The cook we had before left in July, and since then we've been making do, which mostly means the boss has been eating whatever the cook shack produces, and that is not a dignified situation for anyone involved." He paused. "The man who owns this ranch is Phineas Cooper. He'll want to speak with you before any decision is made. You willing to wait while I fetch him?" "I'll wait," Ruth said. Hayes left her standing near the porch, and she took the time to look more carefully at the main house. The windows were clean, she noticed, or at least they had been cleaned recently. Someone cared about certain things and had let others go. There was firewood stacked beside the house in a manner that was precise and careful, split evenly and stacked in a way that showed a methodical mind. But the flower bed along the porch had been taken over entirely by grass, and what had once been a kitchen garden beside the house was now a tangle of dead stalks and volunteer weeds. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, but his boots on the porch steps, the sound of a man who moved with deliberate weight, not heavy but solid. And then Phineas Cooper came around the corner of the porch and she had her first look at the man who owned all of this. He was 32 years old, though he carried something in the set of his jaw that made him seem older at first glance, a seriousness that softened the moment he noticed it in himself and tried to correct it. He was tall, lean without being slight, with dark hair that was overlong at the collar and the kind of hands that told a full biography, scarred and calloused and large. He had gray eyes that she later came to think of as the most honest thing about him, because they showed everything whether he intended them to or not. He was dressed in working clothes, a worn canvas shirt and denim trousers with mud at the knees, which told her he had been working and had not changed before coming to meet her, which in turn told her something about how he viewed the idea of pretense. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said, and his voice was lower than she had expected, careful and quiet. "Tom tells me you've come about the housekeeping position." "That's right," she said. He came down the repaired side of the porch steps and stood at the bottom, which put them nearly at eye level, because she was tall for a woman. He looked at her in a way that was direct without being rude, and she looked back at him in exactly the same way. "Have you done this kind of work before?" he asked. "I managed a household for 4 years in Missouri. Before that I helped run my father's farm in Tennessee from the time I was 12. I'm not afraid of hard work and I don't make promises I can't keep." "Tom said you came from Laramie." "I came through Laramie." Something in his expression shifted, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. He was a man who understood what it meant to have a history that was summarized better by what you did not say than by what you did. He looked at the horse at the hitching post, then back at her. "The horse needs water," he said. "Tom, would you see to that?" Then to her, "Come inside. I'll show you what the position entails." She followed him up the porch steps, careful to take the solid ones. He held the front door open for her, and she stepped into the main house of the Cooper Ranch for the first time. It was a good house. The bones of it were generous and well-made, solid timber construction with high ceilings that kept the summer heat from settling. The main room had a large fireplace, a dining table that could seat 8, and a sitting area with 2 chairs that faced each other across a rug that had once been beautiful and was now worn to translucency at the center. The kitchen was through a door to the right, and it was there that she saw the real evidence of a house that had been without a woman's management for several months. It was not dirty exactly, but it was deeply, fundamentally unorganized. Pots were stacked without order, the pantry shelves were half empty and chaotically arranged. There was a jar of molasses on the counter that had clearly boiled over at some point and been wiped away hastily but not thoroughly, and the table was covered in account ledgers and loose papers that clearly had nowhere else to go. "I do most of my bookwork in here," Phineas said, which explained the papers. "The cook before Mrs. Aldridge. She kept the kitchen herself and the accounts stayed in the study. Since she left I've been using the table and the whole system has come apart somewhat." "I can see that," Ruth said, but she said it without judgment, only as observation. He showed her the rest of the house. The study, which was orderly in the specific way of a man who lived alone and had systems that made sense only to himself. A bedroom at the back of the downstairs. The stairs, and then the upstairs hallway with 3 doors, 2 of which were guest rooms and 1 of which was a smaller room at the end of the hall with a window that looked east over the creek. "This would be your room," he said, opening that last door. It was plain but not uncomfortable. A single bed with an iron frame, a washstand, a small writing desk, a wardrobe. The window, she noticed immediately, caught the morning light in a way that would make it genuinely pleasant. "It's fine," she said. "I need someone who can cook for myself and the hands at midday, manage the house, the pantry, the preserving for winter, and some basic accounting if you're willing. The pay is $12 a month with room and board. I'll advance you your first month if you need it." She turned to look at him. The offer of the advance was generous, and he had made it without ceremony, which meant he had made it because it was practical and not because he expected her gratitude. "I don't need the advance," she said, but I appreciate the offer." She paused. "When would you need me to start?" He almost smiled. It was the smallest possible version of a smile, just a slight change at the corners of his mouth, but it was there. "There are about 15 men who will be very relieved if you start tomorrow morning." "I'll start this afternoon," she said. "The pantry needs attending to before I can cook anything worth eating." He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary, and then he nodded. "All right, Mrs. Thatcher. Welcome to Cooper Ranch." That afternoon she took apart the kitchen systematically, cataloged every item in the pantry with a piece of chalk on a board she found behind the door, made a list of what was needed, and had Tom Hayes drive her to the supply store in town in the ranch wagon before the merchant closed for the day. She spent 4 hours restoring order to the kitchen and pantry, and by 7 o'clock that evening, she had produced a supper that made the cook shack go very quiet when the food arrived. Quiet in the specific reverent way of hungry men confronted with something genuinely good. She made a beef stew with root vegetables, sourdough biscuits that she had started the moment she found a crock of starter living forgotten at the back of the pantry, and a dried apple pie that she had begun the moment she found the apples in the supply order she'd picked up in town. Phineas Cooper ate in the main house alone at the long dining table, as she understood he did every evening. She brought his supper in and set it before him and was turning to leave when he said quietly, "This is the best meal I've eaten since July, Mrs. Thatcher." Then, "July was too long ago," she said, and went back to her kitchen. She lay awake that first night in her room at the end of the upstairs hall, listening to the creek and the night sounds of the Wyoming grasslands, coyotes in the distance and the quiet movement of horses in the corral, and she felt, for the first time in 6 months, something that was not exactly happiness but was the beginning of it. Something like stability. Something like ground beneath her feet. She did not think about Phineas Cooper in any particular way that first night. He was her employer. He had been professional and fair, and that was more than she had expected from some ranchers she had heard about. She thought about the kitchen and the list she had not yet finished, and whether the sourdough starter would behave in this altitude, and then she fell asleep. What she did not know, lying there in the dark, was that Phineas Cooper was also awake 1 floor below her, sitting at his desk in the study with a glass of whiskey that he had not touched, thinking about nothing he could have articulated clearly and everything that had changed that day without his permission. The first week passed in a rhythm that suited both of them, without either of them designing it. Ruth rose before dawn, built the kitchen fire, had coffee ready and breakfast started by the time Phineas came downstairs at 5:30. They were not the sort of people who talked in the morning simply to fill silence, and so they did not. She put his coffee on the table, and he said thank you, and they coexisted in the kitchen, the way 2 people can when they are both fundamentally comfortable with quiet. She had learned within 3 days exactly how he took his coffee, which was black with 1 spoonful of sugar and no more, and she had learned that he was gone by 6 o'clock every morning and back at the main house by noon for the midday meal, which she also learned he preferred substantial over elaborate. He was a working man in every sense, and he ate like one. The hands came to the cook shack at midday and she fed them there, and she got to know them one by one in the way you come to know men who eat your food, which is honestly and without pretense. There was Tom Hayes, the foreman, 60 years old and as reliable as bedrock. There was a young cowboy named Jesse Briggs who was 19, and so earnest it was nearly painful, always the first to offer to carry something heavy. There was a quiet Mexican vaquero named Luis Morno, who had been on the ranch for 8 years, and whose skill with horses was understood by everyone to be something close to magic. There was old Pete Dunnigan, the oldest hand on the ranch at 64, who had started as a trail driver in Texas and ended up here and claimed he would die here, which he said with such good-natured certainty that nobody doubted him. And then there was the matter of the Cooper Ranch itself, which Ruth began to understand more fully as the first week gave way to the second. The ranch ran cattle, about 300 head, which was not a large operation by Wyoming standards but was a solid one. The land was good, the grass was healthy, the creek provided reliable water, but there was a particular heaviness that lived on the property, not in the work itself, which was vigorous and constant, but in the house. The main house had the feeling of a place that had once been full and was now not, and after the second week, Ruth understood why. She learned it from Pete Dunnigan, who was the sort of man who talked freely when he was comfortable, and who had decided by the end of the first week that he was comfortable with Ruth. Mr. Cooper had a wife, Pete told her one afternoon when she brought coffee to the hands during a fencing repair. Her name was Catherine. She was a lovely woman, very kind, always had flowers on the table and music on Sundays. She died 4 years ago. Childbirth. The baby, too. He paused and looked at his coffee cup. It changed him some, not in a bad way. He was always a serious man, but the lightness went out of him. He works hard, keeps the ranch going, treats his men fair. He just don't know what to do with the rest of it anymore. Ruth carried this information carefully, the way you carry something fragile, and she did not speak of it to anyone. But it explained things. The flower bed gone to grass, because who replants a dead woman's flowers? The kitchen in disarray, because who maintains a kitchen when there is no reason to eat with any joy? The rooms upstairs that were guest rooms and never used, because guests brought questions and questions required explanations. She found herself being more careful around him after that, not in a way that expressed pity, which she understood he would hate, but in a way that was simply attentive. She noticed that he came alive out of doors in a way he did not inside the house, and so she sometimes found reasons to step outside herself, to work in the kitchen garden she was slowly reclaiming from the weeds, when she knew he was working near the house. Not to talk to him, necessarily. Just to be nearby in the open air, where he seemed to breathe differently. The kitchen garden became her first real project beyond the kitchen itself. It was the 3rd week of September, which was late for planting most things, but there were cold, hardy crops she could get in that would carry through to early winter, kale and turnips and late carrots, and she began the work of clearing it methodically. She was on her knees in the dirt one afternoon, pulling the dead stalks of what had been a bean row, when she heard his boots stop behind her. "You don't have to do that," Phineas said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was standing at the edge of the garden holding his hat in his hands, and there was something in his face she had not seen there before, a kind of uncertainty that did not fit the capable, self-possessed man she had come to know over the past weeks. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. There's still time to get some things in before the hard frost." He looked at the garden for a moment. "Catherine planted that garden," he said. Then he seemed to regret having said it, not because it was wrong to say it, but because he was not sure what to do with it once it was said. "It was a good garden," Ruth said simply, without making it more than it was. "The soil is still good. I can tell by what grew up in it even when it was untended." She paused. "I won't change what she planted if you remember what it was. I'll try to match it." He looked at her then with an expression she could not fully read, something complicated that moved through his gray eyes too quickly to name. "She had a row of sweet peas along the south fence," he said finally. "Didn't produce anything you could eat, but she said they were for the bees." "Sweet peas are good for bees," Ruth agreed. "I'll plant them in the spring." He put his hat back on and walked away, and she turned back to the dead stalks in her hands, and neither of them mentioned the conversation again. But something had shifted, quietly and without announcement, the way the light shifts in the late afternoon in Wyoming, and you don't always notice it happening until you look up and everything is different. October arrived with a character that reminded everyone in the territory that Wyoming had no patience for people who were not prepared for it. The mornings turned sharp and brilliant, frost on the grass before sunrise, and then a sky so blue by mid-morning that it almost hurt to look at. Ruth expanded her midday cooking to be heartier, more warming, the kind of food that men burning calories in cold air needed. She made elk stew when Lewis came back from a hunt with Tom Hayes at the far end of the property. She made a corn and ham chowder that Jesse Briggs told her was the best thing he had ever eaten, and then looked slightly embarrassed at having said it. She put up 20 jars of applesauce and 14 jars of pickled green beans from the last of what the kitchen garden had produced, and she arranged them on the pantry shelves with a satisfaction that was quiet and deep. Phineas noticed the jars. She came into the pantry one morning to find him standing in front of the shelves looking at them with his hands in his pockets and his head slightly tilted. "You've been busy," he said. "Winter is coming," she said simply. "Mrs. Aldridge never put up this many. Mrs. Aldridge is not here." He turned and looked at her, and he was smiling. Not the almost smile she had seen that first day, but a real one, brief and surprised, as though it had gotten past his defenses before he could think about it. It changed his whole face, and she noticed it the way you notice something beautiful that appears and disappears quickly, a hawk crossing the sun. "No," he said, "she is not." And he walked past her out of the pantry, and she stood there in the smell of vinegar and apple, and thought very carefully about nothing at all for a moment before she went back to her work. The trouble with living in close proximity to someone you are starting to notice is that you begin to notice everything, and the everything is relentless. She noticed the way he spoke to his horses quietly, using their names, with the full attention he gave to everything he cared about. She noticed the book he left face down on the sitting room table, always a different one, which told her he read quickly, which told her something about the breadth of his mind. She noticed that he hummed to himself sometimes when he did not know she was within hearing, tuneless but not unhappy, the sound of a man who was at peace with his solitude even if he had not chosen it. She also noticed, and this was the one that unsettled her, that he had begun to find reasons to be in the kitchen. It started small. He came in for a second cup of coffee and lingered instead of taking it back to the study. He came in to check the account books he had moved back to the study weeks ago, apparently to retrieve one he had left, but the book he picked up and carried out was not an account book. He came in one evening and sat at the kitchen table without a clear reason and watched her work on the supper biscuits, and after a moment said, "Do you mind if I sit here?" "It's your kitchen," she said. "I know," he said. "But it's your space. There's a difference." She looked at him over her shoulder at that, because it was not the kind of thing most men would have said or thought to say. "I don't mind," she said, and meant it. He sat there while she finished the biscuits and got the venison roast into the oven, and they talked, for the first time, about things that were not the house or the ranch or the supply order. He asked her about Tennessee, where she had grown up, and she told him about her father's farm, the Tobacco Rose and the creek, and her younger sister Miriam, who had married a good man from Nashville and whose letters were the most reliable thing in Ruth's life. He told her about growing up in Colorado, his father's mining claims, the way the mountains were so omnipresent that they shaped everything about how you thought about the world. He was quiet when he talked, choosing words with care, and she found that she liked listening to him the way she liked the sound of the creek at night, steady and real and not asking anything of her. "How did you come to have a ranch in Wyoming?" she asked, and it was the most direct question she had asked him about his own history, and she watched to see if he would retreat. He did not. He considered the question honestly. "I came up on a cattle drive in 1872 and saw this land, and something about it made me feel like I had been here before. Not literally, just that it fit." He paused. "I came back the next year with enough money to put a down payment on a section of it, and I spent the following 7 years making it something." "You did that," she said. "Make it something." He looked at the table. "Catherine helped. She had a vision for the house that I didn't have. I had a vision for the land, and she had one for the life on it. Together it was." He stopped. "Complete," she offered. He raised his eyes to hers, and the gray of them was very direct and very unguarded in that moment. "Yes," he said, "complete." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people sitting with a truth that is heavy and also real, and neither of them was afraid of it. "I was married too," she said. It was the first time she had said it directly to him. His name was Daniel Thatcher. He was a charming man who had very little connection to reality when it came to money. He borrowed against things he did not have and promised things he could not deliver. And one day his creditors stopped being patient, and I was left with a house I could not keep and a name that everyone in 3 counties associated with his failures. She kept her voice level. He did not deliberately set out to ruin us. He was just not made for the weight of ordinary life. Phineas was quiet for a moment. "How long ago?" "6 months. 6 months," he said softly, and the weight of what that meant was evident in how he said it. 6 months was nothing. 6 months was barely enough time to find your footing in a new geography, let alone a new life. "I'm not sorry he's gone," she said plainly. "That sounds hard, but I am not sorry. I am sorry for the waste of it, the years, the hope at the beginning. But I'm not sorry to have my own life back, even if it arrived in this condition." She gestured at herself, a small rueful movement that encompassed the borrowed horse and the worn hat and the $4.17 she had walked in with. He looked at her with an expression that was so warm and unguarded that it nearly knocked her off balance. "I think this condition," he said, with a careful preciseness, "is doing very well." She turned back to the stove before he could see her face. The autumn deepened. The first big snowfall came on the 2nd of November and lasted 3 days, and the ranch went into its winter routine, the horses in the warmer stalls. The cattle worked closer to home, the hands spending their mornings on repairs they had deferred through the busy summer. Ruth kept the house warm and the kitchen producing, and on the evening of the 3rd day of snow, she made a pot of chocolate from the tin she had found in the back of the pantry, properly made, with real milk from the dairy cow, and brought it into the sitting room where Phineas was reading by the fire. He looked up when she set the cup on the table beside his chair, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Chocolate," he said. "I found a tin in the pantry. I don't know how old it was." "Old," he said, but he picked up the cup and tasted it and closed his eyes briefly in a way that was so involuntary and so human that she had to look away. "It's good, Mrs. Thatcher." She had been Mrs. Thatcher to him for 6 weeks, and she had been Ruth in her own head for all of that time, and she was tired of the distance it maintained when they had already, in the kitchen that evening 2 weeks ago, traveled a long way past it. "Ruth," she said, "please." He looked at her across the firelight. She was standing near the door, which she had meant to go through directly, and she was not going through it. "Ruth," he said, as if he were testing how it felt, and the answer to the test was apparently satisfactory because something in his face settled. "Then I'm Phineas, though most people who use that name are telling me off." "Phineas," she said, and it felt right. It felt like something clicking into place. "Good night." "Good night, Ruth." She lay awake again that night, but for different reasons than the first night. The first night she had been cataloging her work, her plans, the practical architecture of survival. This night she was doing something else entirely, something she had not done in a very long time, something that felt dangerous and also, underneath the danger, like standing in the sun. She was thinking about him. She was thinking about the way her name sounded in his voice, and the way he had closed his eyes over the chocolate, and the careful, precise way he spoke about things he cared about, as though caring about things was serious work and he meant to do it right. She was thinking about the gray of his eyes in the firelight, and the way his hands looked on the arms of the chair, those large, calloused, competent hands, and she was thinking about the fact that she had been in this house for 6 weeks, and she was no longer sure whether she was working here or living here, and the difference between those two things had become a very important question. The snow made everything slower and closer, as snow does. With the hands confined to nearer work, they ate more often in the cook shack, but also came by the main house kitchen more frequently, and the kitchen became a gathering place in the way that warm kitchens in winter become gathering places. Jessie Briggs was underfoot constantly, always willing to carry wood or water in exchange for whatever was cooling on the rack. Pete Dunnigan came to peel potatoes and tell stories, which was a trade Ruth found entirely fair. Tom Hayes stopped in every morning to go over the day's work with Phineas, and those conversations often happened at the kitchen table with Ruth's coffee as an implicit part of the meeting. She was part of this place. She felt it the way you feel the ground under your feet, not consciously but constantly, a fundamental orientation. It was Tom Hayes who first said it out loud, and he said it to her alone one morning when Phineas had already gone out to the barn and Jessie had run off on an errand and the kitchen was quiet. "You've done something good here," Tom said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. "And I don't just mean the cooking, though Lord knows that's been a mercy. I mean to him." He glanced toward the door Phineas had gone through. "He's different since you came. He's here again. You know what I mean. He was here in body before, but now he's here in himself." Ruth did not say anything for a moment. She turned back to the bread she was kneading and worked the dough with careful, even pressure. "He's a good man," she said finally. "He is," Tom agreed. "Best I've ever worked for, and I've worked for more than I can count. He deserves good things." He paused significantly. "So do you." She did not look up from the bread. "Tom, I'm just saying what I see," he said mildly, and finished his coffee and left. What she did not know was that Phineas was having his own version of this conversation at approximately the same time with Louis Morneau in the barn. Louis was not a man who spoke unnecessarily, which was why, when he did speak about something personal, it carried weight. "She is going to leave in the spring," Louis said. He was working a saddle repair and did not look up. "When the snow melts and the roads are open again." Phineas was looking at a fence post he was supposed to be evaluating and seeing nothing. "She has a job here." "A job is not a reason to stay," Louis said. "A job is a reason to stay until a better reason comes or until something calls her away. She is a woman who should have more than a job." Phineas said nothing. "I have watched you both for 2 months," Louis said. "I'm not blind and I have eyes." This construction was so artlessly redundant that it would have made Ruth smile if she had heard it. "What I see is 2 people who are being very careful for no good reason." "It is a complicated situation," Phineas said. Louis looked up from the saddle. "What is complicated about it?" Phineas had no answer that held up to scrutiny. The event that changed the temperature of things between them happened on a Thursday in mid-November, and it was entirely undramatic, which was somehow the most dramatic thing about it. She was on the ladder changing the curtains in the upstairs guest room, a task she had put off long enough. And the ladder, which was old and had a cracked rung that she had not properly assessed before climbing it, gave way on the 3rd step from the top. It was not a catastrophic fall. The room was not that large and the ceiling was not that high, but it was fast and startling, and she landed badly, more on her wrist than her palm, and hit her shoulder against the windowsill on the way down. She stayed on the floor for a moment, doing an inventory, and determined that nothing was broken, only badly jarred. She heard him on the stairs fast, and then he was in the doorway, and his face had a look on it she had not seen before, a kind of undisguised alarm that he did not try to manage. "Ruth." He was across the room in 3 strides and kneeling beside her, and his hands were on her shoulders with a careful steadiness that was trying very hard not to shake. "Are you hurt?" "My wrist," she said, "and my shoulder. I don't think anything is broken." He took her wrist in both his hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size and toughness of them, and he examined it slowly, pressing gently to find the tender places, watching her face for pain. "The rung cracked," she said. "I should have fixed that ladder 2 months ago," he said, in a voice that was very low and very controlled, and she understood that the control was covering something that was not control. He was frightened, not in a theatrical way, but in the deep, quiet way of a man who has already lost something and who felt, for one terrible second, the possibility of losing something again. "It's all right," she said. "I'm all right." He looked up from her wrist to her face, and they were very close, closer than they had been before, and the alarm in his gray eyes was transitioning into something else. He was still holding her wrist in both of his hands. "You scared me," he said. It came out more honestly than he had intended, and he knew it, and he did not take it back. "I know," she said very quietly. "I'm sorry." He helped her up, keeping his hand at her arm until she was steady, and then he stepped back to a proper distance but not quite far enough. They were still closer than they had been before the fall, some invisible boundary renegotiated by the moment. He looked at the broken ladder. "I'll get the ladder from the barn," he said, "and I'll fix the curtains. You don't need to do that." "I want to," he said, and she recognized her own words from the garden returned to her. He left to get the ladder, and she stood in the center of the guest room with her sore wrist held against her chest, and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. He came back with a sound ladder, and he changed the curtains himself, all of them, while she stood and directed him in terms of the hooks and the alignment. It was a domestic and uncomplicated thing, and it lasted about 40 minutes, and it was one of the most pleasant 40 minutes she had spent in a very long time. They talked about the weather and the cattle and Pete Dunnigan's knee, which had been giving him trouble, and then, somehow, about music. She told him her mother had played the piano badly but enthusiastically, and he told her that his mother had sung in a church choir in Colorado and that he had inherited neither of their talents. "Do you miss music?" she asked. He looked at the curtain he was adjusting and thought about it seriously. "I miss Sunday evenings," he said. "Catherine used to play the harmonica, which is a funny instrument, but she was genuinely good at it. We used to sit on the porch and she'd play and I'd listen." He paused. "I miss the version of myself that existed in those moments. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said. "It makes complete sense." He finished the last curtain and came down from the ladder and folded it under his arm. He looked at her across the neat, freshly curtained room. "Do you have anything like that?" he asked. "Something you miss from before?" She thought about it honestly. "I used to draw," she said. "When I was young, before the farm work took up everything. I drew horses mostly. I was fairly good at it. I didn't know that. There are many things you don't know about me," she said lightly. "I'd like to know them," he said, and it came out with a directness that surprised even him, and the room went quiet. She met his eyes. "I'd like that too," she said just as directly. He went back to the barn with the ladder. She went back to the kitchen. But for the rest of that day, they both moved through the house with a different awareness, as though the air itself had a slightly different quality, and the evening meal was quieter than usual, and neither of them minded the quiet in the same way they had minded it, or had not minded it, or whatever the right word was for the complicated emotional arithmetic of two people in the process of discovering each other. The days shortened and the cold deepened, and in December the ranch settled into the patient close rhythm of a winter that would not break for months. Ruth began spending her evenings in the sitting room. It had started because the kitchen cooled down once the cooking was done, and the sitting room had the big fireplace. But the practical reason was layered over a personal one that she was too honest with herself to deny. She brought her mending and her letters to Miriam there, and he read, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both the talking and the not talking were good. He found her paper and a piece of charcoal in the first week of December. She did not know where he had gotten them. She had not mentioned drawing since that one conversation in the guest room, but he set them on the table beside her usual chair without comment, just placed them there and sat down in his own chair and opened his book, and she looked at the paper and charcoal for a moment and then picked up the charcoal. She drew a horse. The first horse she had drawn in years, one of his horses from the corral, the big bay she had watched every day from the kitchen window. She was out of practice and it showed at first, the proportions slightly off, the foreshortening uncertain, but then muscle memory returned and her hand began to know what to do, and the horse emerged from the paper in a way that made her feel something she had forgotten she could feel. Phineas watched her from behind his book. Not intrusively, not constantly, just occasionally, the way you watch something that gives you pleasure. He said nothing until she turned the paper toward him somewhat tentatively, as though she were not sure what she was offering. He set down his book and looked at the drawing for a long time. "That's Copperhead," he said, "the bay." "Yes. That is very good, Ruth." She looked at the drawing, then at him. "I'm rusty." "Even rusty," he said. "That is a very good drawing." He paused. "May I keep it?" She felt warmth rise in her face, which she managed by looking back at the drawing. "If you want it." He put it on the mantelpiece, leaning against the wood. It was still there 3 days later. She had drawn 4 more things by then: 2 horses and a landscape of the creek in snow, and a study of Pete Dunnigan's weathered hands from memory. And they were all on the mantelpiece. An accidental gallery along the fireplace of this room that had been so empty before. The evening he told her she could stay as long as she wanted, that the position was permanent if she chose to make it so. She was sitting across from him in the firelight, and the wind was doing something enormous and absolute outside the windows. And inside the room there was the fire and the drawings on the mantelpiece, and the mugs of coffee and this man who had come to be so necessary to her that she was no longer frightened by it. "I want to be clear about something," he said, putting down his book. "When I say the position is permanent, I mean this. This ranch is your home if you want it to be, not just a place to work. I want you to know that." She looked at him. The firelight did what firelight does to gray eyes, turned them warm and deep and honest. "Are you saying that because you want a good housekeeper to stay?" she asked, and it was a direct question that asked something beyond what the words contained. He held her gaze. "No," he said, "I am not saying it because of the housekeeping." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the most full silence she had ever sat inside, full of everything they had been to each other over the past 3 months, and everything they might be, and she was not afraid of any of it. She had been afraid in the weeks before of this exact moment, afraid that wanting it would mean losing the careful equilibrium they had built, afraid that she was wrong about what she felt or what he felt or whether any of it was real and not just the product of winter proximity and mutual loneliness. But sitting in the firelight looking at this man she had come to know in all the most ordinary and therefore truest ways, she was not afraid of any of it. "Phineas," she said. "Ruth," he said. And then, because neither of them was a person who could say the most important thing without evidence, she got up from her chair and he got up from his, and they met in the center of the rug that was worn to translucency at the center, and he took her face in those large, careful hands with the gentleness she had felt on her wrist in the guest room, and he kissed her once, slowly, and with absolute attention. And then she put both arms around him, and they stood there in the warm light of the fire, while the Wyoming wind screamed around the corners of the house. And there was nothing in either of them that was not completely present and completely willing. "I have been looking for you," he said against her hair. "I didn't know it, but I have been looking for you." She held on tighter. "I know," she said. "I know exactly what you mean." The winter remained, but it was different now. The snow was the same snow, but there was something combustible and alive inside the house that changed the quality of the cold outside, made it beautiful rather than merely endured. They were careful with each other, in the way of people who are serious about something, and do not want to rush it into something it is not ready to be. There was a propriety to the situation that they both respected, not out of rigidity, but because they both understood that what was building between them was worth the patience. Christmas came, the first Christmas the main house had decorated for in 4 years. Ruth was fairly certain. She cut pine branches from the trees along the creek and put them on the mantelpiece between the drawings and the fireplace. She made a wreath for the front door from pine and dried berries, and Jesse Briggs found this so moving that he immediately went and wrote a letter to his mother in Kansas that was apparently more sentimental than anything he had written her in 2 years, a fact Tom Hayes reported to Ruth with barely suppressed amusement. For Christmas dinner she made a feast, a proper one, the whole ranch at the long dining table in the main house, all of them, Tom Hayes and Louis Morneau and Jesse Briggs and Pete Dunnigan, and the 4 other hands whose names were Callum and Ruddy and George, and a taciturn man from Tennessee who everyone called Birch, and who upon discovering Ruth was also from Tennessee treated her with a warmth he showed no one else. Phineas sat at the head of the table and looked down the length of it at all these men who worked his land, and at Ruth moving between the kitchen and the table, and his expression was something she caught once from the doorway, when he didn't know she was watching, and what she saw on his face was so uncomplicated and so complete that she had to stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame simply to let it settle into her. He had made her a gift. He put it beside her plate before anyone else sat down, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. Inside the paper was a sketchbook, a proper one, thick creamy pages sewn into a cloth cover, and beside it a set of drawing pencils in a fitted case. She looked up at him across the table. "For the drawings," he said, and the simplicity of it was what undid her, the matter-of-fact tenderness of it. This man who had gone to Laramie in the cold and found a sketchbook because he wanted her to have better paper than the scraps she had been using. She gave him the one gift she had been able to make, a pair of gloves she had knit from the heaviest wool she had found in the dry goods store, knit slowly and carefully, and with more concentration than anything had required of her in years. He put them on at the table and flexed his hands in them and said, "Perfect," in a voice that was not really about the gloves. New Year came and went, and January was brutal and clear, with the kind of cold that clarified everything. The work of the ranch continued in its winter form, and Ruth managed the house and the cooking and began filling the sketchbook steadily, drawing everything, the horses and the landscape and the hands and the shape of the hills to the west at different hours of the day. Drawing had come back to her like a recovered language, and she spoke it fluently now. She and Phineas talked in the evenings in the sitting room about everything and nothing, about plans for the spring, about the cattle market in Cheyenne that he was thinking about attending in March, about the possibility of expanding the operation in a way that was cautious and considered. She told him more about Missouri, and he listened with the full attention that was one of the things she had come to love about him, the willingness to listen as though what you were saying mattered. She told him about Daniel Thatcher without bitterness and without self-pity, the whole story, and he heard it in the same way, understanding what it cost her and not making it more than it was. He told her about Catherine, the real story, not the edited version, the 5 years they had together that had been genuinely good, and then the one terrible night that had been the end of everything. She held his hand while he talked about it, and he let her, and that was the point at which she understood that he was going to be all right. He proposed to her on a Tuesday in February. It was not a dramatic occasion. They were in the kitchen after supper and she was washing the dishes, and he was at the table with his coffee going through an account book, which was where he usually was at that hour, and he looked up from the accounts and said, with the directness that was the best thing about him, "Ruth, will you marry me?" It was not precisely a question. It was the kind of statement that is nevertheless a question, said with certainty about the wanting but genuine openness about the answer. She dried her hands on her apron and turned around. He was looking at her with those honest gray eyes and the slight tension at the corners of his mouth that meant he was more anxious than he was letting on, and she loved him so thoroughly in that moment. This serious and careful man who had been so methodically putting himself back together for 4 years until she arrived and changed the geometry of it, that she could barely contain what she felt. "Yes," she said. He stood up from the table and came to her and kissed her in the middle of the kitchen, which they had never done before because the kitchen was the working center of things, and this was something entirely different. And then he held her against him with the solid certainty of a man who has found something he intends to keep. And outside the kitchen window, the February stars were out over the Wyoming grasslands in their full winter brilliance. Cold and clear and so numerous it was almost impossible to comprehend. "When?" she asked. "As soon as the roads are clear enough to get a preacher out here," he said, which was so characteristically pragmatic that she laughed into his shoulder. They were married in March, the 15th of March, 1883, on a day when the snow was still on the ground but the air had the first hesitant warmth of the approaching spring. The preacher came from Laramie, a weathered and cheerful man named Reverend Alcott, who had married a good many frontier couples in his time, and who performed the ceremony in the main room of the house with Tom Hayes and Louis Morno and Jesse Briggs and Pete Dunnigan as witnesses. Ruth wore her best dress, which was good but not elaborate, a deep burgundy that she had owned since before Missouri, and that had come with her in the trunk that was the only thing she had saved. She had pressed it carefully and done something with her copper hair that was more intentional than her usual severe pins, letting it be soft around her face. Phineas wore his best suit, which was dark wool and fit him well, and he had shaved carefully, and his gray eyes when she came down the stairs were something she would remember for the rest of her life, that particular shade of love and disbelief combined, as though he could not quite reconcile the fact that he was this fortunate. They said the words to each other in the clear morning light coming through the windows she had cleaned last week in preparation, and when Reverend Alcott said he may kiss his bride, Phineas kissed her with the same quality of full attention he brought to everything he cared about. And Jesse Briggs, who was 19 and very near tears and trying extremely hard not to show it, was saved from full embarrassment only by Pete Dunnigan slapping him on the back hard enough to require a cough. Ruth made the wedding dinner herself, which Phineas had offered to prevent and which she had declined, because cooking for people she loved was one of the ways she expressed love, and she was not going to surrender it for a single dinner on her own wedding day. She made roast chicken and potatoes and early spring greens from the first of what the garden was beginning to produce, and biscuits, and a cake from dried fruit and good flour and the last of the winter's butter. And they all sat at the long table and ate and talked, and Pete Dunnigan told a story about a wedding he had attended in Texas in 1859 that deteriorated into such chaos, by the third telling that no one could verify any of the facts. And Tom Hayes proposed a toast in a voice that was steady except at the very end where it wasn't, and Louis Morno said, quietly, to no one in particular, "This is a good day," which was more than he usually said, and was therefore the most eloquent thing anyone said all evening. After the others had gone and the house was quiet, Ruth and Phineas Cooper sat together on the front porch in the March evening, wrapped in a heavy quilt she had dragged out against the cold, watching the last light leave the western sky. The snow still covered the hills in the distance, but the creek was beginning to move again, audible from the porch, and somewhere in the darkness a nighthawk was calling. "Well, Mrs. Cooper," he said. "Well, Mr. Cooper," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat there while the stars came out, the same Wyoming stars she had watched from her window on the first night she had slept in this house, when she had had $4.17 and a borrowed horse, and a life that had narrowed to a single sign on a general store wall. She thought about that woman on that night, exhausted and proud and facing forward regardless, and she felt an enormous tenderness for her. "I want to write to my sister," she said. "Tell her. Write to her tomorrow," he said. "Tell her to come visit in the summer. She'll come and never leave." "Good," he said. "There's room." She tilted her face up to look at him in the dark. This man who had waited 4 years in his solitude without knowing he was waiting, who had run his ranch with the competent steadiness of someone who understood that life continues even when it stops making sense, who had recognized her the moment he came around the corner of the porch, and found her standing at his gate with her 3-state dust and her unflinching gaze. He looked back at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen from the kitchen doorway on Christmas Day, that uncomplicated and complete thing that she now had a word for. She kissed him, there on the porch in the cold March evening, and he pulled the quilt tighter around them both, and the creek moved steadily in the dark, and the ranch was quiet and whole around them, and neither of them needed to say anything more that night. Spring arrived in earnest in April and transformed the land with the sudden urgency that is Wyoming's particular quality, no gradual warming but a rush, an insistence. The grass came back green and voracious, the creek ran high and clear with snowmelt, and the ranch went into its busy season with renewed energy. The calves came, 17 of them, and Phineas and the hands were working long days and short nights, and Ruth kept the cook shack running and the house in order and the pantry stocked, and she planted the kitchen garden in full, all the cold hardy vegetables, and then the warm season ones, tomatoes and beans and squash, in the beds she had been tending since the autumn. She planted sweet peas along the south fence. Phineas found her there one morning, patting the seeds into the soil, and he stopped and looked at the fence, and then at her, and something crossed his face that was grief and gratitude so perfectly combined they could not be separated. "For the bees," she said. He crouched beside her and put his hand over hers in the dirt for a moment. "For the bees," he agreed. This was one of the things she had come to understand about loving him. His past was not something to be managed or circumvented. It was part of the man she loved, the grief and the loss woven into the substance of him, and she did not ask him to be otherwise. Catherine had been real, and his love for her had been real, and his grief was the mark of how much that mattered. Ruth did not feel diminished by this. She felt, if anything, more sure of him, because a man who knows how to love deeply and grieve honestly is a man who has the full range of what love requires. Miriam wrote back to Ruth's letter within 3 weeks, a letter so long and so emotional that Ruth read it at the kitchen table and had to press the corner of her apron against her eyes twice. Miriam was coming in July, with her husband James and their 2 children, a boy of 6 named Thomas and a girl of 4 named Eliza. She was coming for the summer, and she said, just as Ruth had predicted, that she was in no particular hurry to leave. Ruth read the letter to Phineas over supper, and he listened with his chin on his hand, and when she finished he said, "We should fix the large guest room properly before July. The mattress needs replacing." She lowered the letter. "You've never met these people. They're yours," he said simply. "That makes them mine." She picked up her fork and looked at her plate and said nothing, because some things were too full for words and required a moment to simply be held. May went by in a blur of ranch work and garden work and life. She found herself drawing every free moment she had, the sketchbook filling steadily. She drew Phineas constantly, which she suspected he knew, and which he bore with the private amusement of a man who is flattered and would never say so. She drew him on horseback from the kitchen window, the silhouette of him against the big Wyoming sky precise and familiar. She drew his hands on the account books. She drew him asleep in the chair by the fire with the book on his chest, and the particular relaxation of a man who has worked physically hard all day and found rest genuinely. He caught her drawing him once, specifically and deliberately, while he was working at the kitchen table. He looked up and saw the sketchbook open in her lap and raised an eyebrow. "Don't move," she said. He held very still for 30 seconds, which was all she needed, and then returned to the accounts with a small, satisfied expression that she also, quietly, drew. In June, something happened that brought a brief sharp edge of the harder world into the piece they had built. A man came to the ranch gate, dusty and hollow-eyed, a stranger who was clearly in some distress. He gave his name as Edward Pierce and said he was looking for work, that his horse had gone lame outside of town, and he had walked the last 8 miles. Ruth was in the yard when he arrived, and she gave him water and food while Tom Hayes went to find Phineas. Phineas came and spoke with the man, and there was something careful in how he did it, the practiced assessment of a man who has learned that desperation and dishonesty sometimes travel together. But Edward Pierce turned out to be honest if unlucky, a homesteader whose claim had failed after 2 bad winters in succession, whose wife had taken their daughter to her parents in Illinois, whose situation was the kind of story the territory produced with regularity in those years, men who had come west with high intentions and found the land beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Phineas gave him a position with the ranch, a temporary one to start. Ruth watched this transaction from the porch and felt the usual complicated emotions that the sight of injustice at the edge of survival produced in her. The awareness that the territory's promise was not equally distributed, that it broke people who had done nothing wrong, That a fair man like Phineas giving a desperate man a chance was both an act of individual grace and a very small correction to a very large imbalance. Edward Pierce turned out to be a solid worker, quiet and grateful and competent with cattle, and he stayed through the summer and into the fall, and in October he got a letter from his wife saying she was willing to come back and try again if he had found his footing. And when he read it at the supper table in the cook's shack, he put the letter face down and said nothing for so long that Jessie Briggs quietly got up and went to find Ruth, who came and sat across from him and told him to write back to her that night. He wrote back that night. His wife arrived in November with their daughter, a small 3-year-old named Agnes with her father's eyes, and the family took a room in Laramie, and Edward kept working at the Cooper Ranch, and it was, Phineas said to Ruth that evening, the kind of story that made the balance sheet look better than any profit. Miriam arrived in July with James and the children as promised, and the Cooper Ranch house was full in a way it had never been in Ruth's tenure there, full of noise and activity, and the specific kind of chaos that a 6-year-old boy in an unfamiliar place produces. Young Thomas was immediately attached to Jessie Briggs, who was the exact right age and temperament to be a small boy's hero. And Jessie took him on a very slow and very safe tour of the corral on one of the gentler horses, with an expression of exaggerated responsibility that made Tom Hayes laugh for 5 minutes straight. Miriam was small and dark and sharp-eyed where Ruth was tall and copper-haired and steady, but they were unmistakably sisters, something in the way they moved through a kitchen together, the economy of motion, the shared shorthand. Miriam cried when she saw Ruth, which Ruth had expected, and hugged her for a long time, which Ruth had also expected, and then pulled back and looked at her with the assessing love of a younger sister and said, "You look different. You look like yourself." "That's exactly right," Ruth said. Miriam studied Phineas with the careful scrutiny that sisters apply to the men their sisters have chosen, and Phineas bore this scrutiny with patience and without performance, simply being himself, which was, Ruth thought with private satisfaction, the correct strategy. By the third day Miriam had told James, in a conversation Ruth was not supposed to have overheard through the open guest room window, but did, that she thought Phineas Cooper was the most quietly decent man she had ever met, and that Ruth had done something extraordinarily right for once. Ruth had kept this to herself, but it had settled in her chest like a warm coal. The summer visit stretched to 6 weeks, the longest James could take from his work in Nashville, and when the day came for them to leave, Ruth stood on the porch and held her nephew and her niece in turn, and felt the specific ache of loving people who live far away. Miriam held her hands on the porch steps and looked at her with those dark, knowing eyes. "You're happy," Miriam said. "Genuinely." "Genuinely," Ruth confirmed. "Good." Miriam squeezed her hands. "You write to me every 2 weeks." "Every 2 weeks," Ruth said. "Or Phineas can write. He writes better than I do." "He does not," Phineas said from behind her, which made Miriam laugh and James shake his hand warmly, and the children wave from the wagon seat. And then the wagon was moving down the road, and Ruth watched it until it was gone, and Phineas put his hand on the back of her neck gently, and she leaned back against him. "I want children," she said. She had not said it before, had been waiting for the right moment, and this moment, watching her sister's children go, felt right. "I know," he said, and his voice had the quiet weight of a man who has thought about this and is ready for the thinking to become something real. "So do I." By September Ruth knew she was expecting. She had suspected for several weeks, and she was certain by the time the aspens on the far hills turned gold. She told Phineas at breakfast on a Wednesday morning, calmly and directly, because that was how they told each other important things. She said, "I believe I'm expecting a baby, and I think it will be in the spring." He set down his coffee cup very carefully. He was still for a moment that was not actually very long but felt significant, the way a held breath feels longer than it is. Then he looked at her with gray eyes that were doing the same thing they had done when she came down the stairs in the burgundy dress on their wedding day, that thing that was too complete to be named simply. "Ruth," he said. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in both of his, those large, careful hands, and looked up at her and said nothing, because there was nothing that was adequate. She put one hand against his cheek and he leaned into it. "Everything will be all right," she said, because she understood more than anyone what previous experience had put into this moment for him. "I know," he said. "With you, I know." The pregnancy changed the quality of the autumn in the way that all important things change the quality of time. The ranch work continued, the harvest of the kitchen garden, the putting up of preserves, the preparation for winter. Ruth continued working at her usual pace with Phineas's careful observation that never tipped into overbearing, because he understood her, and understood that her capability was part of who she was and not a thing to be taken from her. He added small, practical things. He fixed every loose step and uneven board on every staircase in the house. He built a second shelf in the kitchen at a height that required no reaching. He asked Tom Hayes to add another man to the winter crew so that some of the heavier supply tasks could be handled without Ruth. She noticed all of it and said nothing directly, only squeezed his hand one evening in the sitting room, and he looked at her over the book in a way that told her he understood. She continued to draw. The sketchbook was nearly full by December, and he got her 2 more for Christmas, the same heavy-paged ones, and a better lamp for the sitting room because the evenings were long. She drew the pregnancy, not in any embarrassing way, but in the unsentimental, accurate way she drew everything, her own hands on the larger architecture of her middle, the changes that came with time, a private record in pencil and shadow. She drew a horse for the baby's room, a big warm drawing of Copperhead, the bay, done in the good pencils on the best paper, and she framed it herself in a simple pine frame and put it on the wall of the room that they had quietly designated the nursery. Phineas had made a cradle over the winter evenings, working in the barn with wood and tools, and a patience that Ruth found so moving, she occasionally had to leave the barn before he saw her face. It was a good cradle, solid and smooth, made from the same timber as the house, with rockers that moved evenly, and it was the most useful, beautiful thing she had ever been given. The baby came in April, almost exactly a year after the sweet peas went into the ground along the south fence, and he was a boy, healthy and indignant about being in the world, with a head of dark hair and his father's gray eyes already, or what would become gray eyes, still the blue slate of new things. Ruth held him in the bedroom of the main house, while the spring sun came through the clean windows, and the sound of the creak came through the open sash, and she felt the full weight of everything that had led to this room and this moment, the $4.17 and the borrowed horse and the sign on the general store wall, and the man who had come around the corner of the porch and looked at her as though she were already known to him. Phineas sat on the edge of the bed beside her and held his son with a careful reverence that was so complete and so unguarded that she watched his face because she did not want to miss a moment of it. He looked at the baby and then at her and then at the baby again, and his eyes were gray and wet and full of everything he had been through and everything that this new thing meant, and she put her head against his shoulder and they stayed that way for a long time. "What will we name him?" she asked. He had thought about this. He had told her several weeks ago that he had been thinking about names, and she had told him she had as well, and they had agreed to decide when they saw him. Now he looked at this dark-haired boy who was beginning to investigate the world with cautious gray eyes and said, "William, Will, for every day." She said the name quietly, testing it. "William Cooper." She looked at her son. "Will." The name fit him the way good things fit without effort. "After your father?" she asked. "My father's name was George," he said, "and he was not a man worth naming someone after, just Will, for his own reasons." "Will it is," she said. Tom Hayes, when he heard the name, said good solid name with great satisfaction. Jesse Briggs visited the nursery with his hat in both hands and looked at the baby in the cradle with an expression of profound solemnity and said, "He's very small," which Ruth confirmed he was, and which seemed to reassure Jesse in some way. Louis Morneau came to the doorway of the nursery and looked at the baby and at Ruth and at Phineas and said, "Good," which was exactly the right amount of words and contained everything. Pete Dunnigan, who had known this ranch longer than anyone, held William Cooper for approximately 45 seconds in the kitchen and then handed him back to Ruth with great care and said, "He'll be a horseman," with the authority of a man who has been wrong about very little in 64 years. Life settled into its new shape. A house that had been quiet was no longer quiet. Will was a good-natured baby who slept well and ate well, and was deeply interested in everything that moved, horses above all, which delighted his father. By the time he was 4 months old, he was watching the corral from the kitchen window with a focus that made Ruth laugh out loud. By 6 months, Phineas had begun taking him out to the stable in the mornings, a small bundled thing held against his father's chest while he did the horses, and Will watched the animals with an attention that was already almost reverent. Ruth's letter to Miriam with the news of Will's birth produced a return letter of such enthusiasm that it took 2 envelopes, and a promise that Miriam's family would come the following summer and would stay longer. Ruth pinned this promise to the wall of the kitchen, because Miriam's promises had a tendency to soften under pressure, and she intended to hold her to this one. The ranch grew slowly and well in the way that things grow when they are built on honest foundations. Phineas added 20 head to the cattle operation in the 2nd year of their marriage, a careful expansion rather than an ambitious one, and the results justified the care. The land was good and they worked it honestly, and the years were reasonably kind, not uniformly. The winter of 1885 was brutal and cost them cattle, and one badly cold week nearly cost them Jesse Briggs, who had been riding through it and came back to the ranch barely coherent with cold, and Ruth put him by the fire and fed him broth for 2 days until the color came back to his face, and he was embarrassing himself by thanking her constantly. Miriam did come back the 2nd summer, and the 3rd, and by the 3rd summer she was talking to James about the possibilities of land in Wyoming, which James was cautiously interested in, and Ruth told Phineas privately that she thought it was going to happen, which was the best news she had had in some time. Will turned 2 and then 3, dark-haired and gray-eyed and constitutionally interested in horses and dogs and the mechanics of things, always examining whatever Phineas was working on with a focused intelligence that made his father look at him, sometimes with an expression Ruth recognized from her own mirror. She kept drawing, filling sketchbooks steadily, and by the time Will was 3 she had a substantial body of work, and Pete Dunnigan had told her, with the authority of a man who had seen many things and feared nothing, that she drew as good as anyone he had ever seen in a picture book, and better than most. Ruth planted the kitchen garden every spring, and the sweet peas went along the south fence every year without exception. The bees came for them. In the summer evenings, she and Phineas sat on the porch the way couples sit when they have found their particular and irreplaceable balance, not needing to fill the air but filling it sometimes because they wanted to, talking about the ranch and the cattle and Will and the news from Laramie and the books they had each been reading, and whatever was beautiful in the particular quality of the evening light. He hummed to himself still, on the evenings when he didn't know she was listening, and she had told him once that she liked it, which had made him self-conscious for approximately 1 week before he forgot to be self-conscious about it again. In the autumn of 1886, when Will was 3.5 years old and had recently determined that the world was best navigated at a full run in all directions, Ruth told Phineas over breakfast that there was going to be a 2nd baby. He received this news with the same quality of complete presence he had given the first time, and he kissed her over the coffee cups, and then spent the remainder of the morning in the barn with an energy that Tom Hayes recognized immediately, and reported back to the hands with great satisfaction. The second child arrived in April of 1887, a girl this time, born on a morning when the sweet peas were just beginning to show the first green of their new growth. A small, fierce girl with Ruth's copper hair and Ruth's brown eyes, and her father observed with amusement Ruth's particular expression of having already assessed the situation and reached several conclusions. Her name was Clara. Clara Cooper, after no one in particular, just a name that fit her the moment it was said, and she was exactly what she looked like, fierce and sweet and constitutionally opposed to sleep. And Will, who had by now decided that his household required his management and protection, took one look at his sister and became devoted to her immediately in the way of small boys who are suddenly and unexpectedly given something important to be responsible for. The family of 4 lived in the house on the creek, and the years were good years, full of the ordinary remarkable things that fill good years. Will learned to ride before he was 5, solemnly and then with pleasure, and then with the unconscious competence of someone for whom it was always going to be natural. Clara talked in full sentences before she was 2, and interrogated everyone on the ranch with questions so specific and persistent that Jesse Briggs, who was now 24 and had been on the ranch for 5 years, and was close to family in every way that mattered, told her once that she asked more questions in a morning than his whole family asked in a week, to which Clara responded by asking him a question about that. Ruth continued drawing and began, in the 3rd year after Clara's birth, to teach Will to draw as well, which he approached with the same deliberate concentration his father brought to everything. Phineas came into the kitchen one afternoon to find them both bent over the table with pencils, very serious, and he stood in the doorway for a moment simply looking at them, and then turned around and went back outside before they saw him, because the feeling was too large and too good to manage in front of witnesses. Pete Dunnigan's knee finally forced him into lighter work in 1888, and Phineas, without being asked and without ceremony, adjusted his position and pay to accommodate it. Pete worked from the stable and the cook shack, and did the harness mending and the tool sharpening, tasks that did not require his knee, and he told Ruth one afternoon that Phineas Cooper was the best employer a man could ask for, which she agreed with completely. The ranch was whole. It was more than a working operation and more than a family home. It was a community, small but real, of people who had found each other across the contingencies of circumstance and chosen to stay. Tom Hayes, who had been on this land before Phineas had, who had helped build the bunkhouse and the first corral and every improvement since, was as much a fixture as the creek. Louis Mornow's horses were the finest in the county, a reputation that had grown steadily and now brought buyers from as far as Cheyenne. Jesse Briggs had grown from an earnest 19-year-old into a competent, confident young man who, in the spring of 1888, brought a girl from Laramie named Martha to the ranch for Sunday dinner with the look of a man who has made a decision and wants his family's approval. Ruth liked Martha immediately. Phineas shook Jesse's hand at the gate when they left, and Jesse understood from the handshake and the expression that accompanied it that the approval was given. Miriam and James did eventually buy land south of Laramie in 1889, a modest homestead that was within a half-day's ride of the Cooper Ranch, and the families became the kind of close that geography allows when geography cooperates. Thomas and Will, who had found each other irresistible from the first summer, were near inseparable once the families were within riding distance. Clara and young Eliza, who was a year older, regarded each other with the specific scrutiny of girls who are deciding whether to be friends, and then decided very quickly, in the way of girls who are both intelligent and lonely for good company, that yes, the sweet peas came every spring. Ruth drew everything. Phineas ran the ranch with the same careful competence he had always had, and the gray in his dark hair came slowly and honestly, and suited him in the way things suit people who have earned them. Ruth grew into the woman she would have been all along if the years before Laramie had given her half the chance, steady and warm and capable, and fiercely loved by the man who had found her at his gate with dust on her boots and a direct gaze, and a refusal to be less than she was. Will was 7 when he asked his mother, on a spring morning in the kitchen garden while she was thinning the carrot seedlings and he was nominally helping, where she had come from. He knew the broad version, that she had come from Missouri and before that Tennessee, but he wanted the specific version, the story. She sat back on her heels and looked at her son, this dark-haired, gray-eyed boy who was so entirely his father's child and also, in ways that delighted her, hers. She told him the story. Not all of it, not the parts that required adult vocabulary, but the true shape of it. That she had come to Wyoming with almost nothing and had walked through the gate at the end of the lane and asked for work. And then what? Will asked. And then I met your father, she said. And then, she smiled. And then everything. Will considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old evaluating a story. Was he nice right away? He was fair right away, she said. Nice took a little longer, but fair is actually better. Will thought about this. I think I'll be fair and nice, he decided. That, she said, would be very good. He went back to thinning the carrots, and she looked across the kitchen garden at the sweet peas coming up along the south fence, and beyond them the creek in its spring running, and beyond that the hills with their patient permanence, and she felt the full, completed weight of the life she was living, its dailiness and its depth, and the way it had arrived exactly like this, on an October morning in 1882. In the form of a sign on a wall and a gate at the end of a lane and a man who came around the corner of his own porch and looked at her like she was already known to him. She had come to the ranch looking for work. She had found the work, and she had done it well, and she would do it as long as she was able. But she had found something else too, something that had been waiting here without knowing it was waiting, that had been built into the shape of this land and this house, and this man as surely as the timber was built into the walls. She had found the life she was supposed to be living. On a Sunday evening that summer, with the long light lying flat and golden across the grassland, and the sweet peas spilling their scent over the fence, and Will and Clara asleep upstairs, and the creek running its steady commentary in the dark, Ruth and Phineas Cooper sat on the front porch together in the way they had been sitting on this porch for years now, her leaning against him, his arm around her, the quilt across their knees in the evening cool. The ranch was quiet and the land was enormous, and the sky above it was full of the particular stars that belonged to Wyoming, bright and uncountable and without apology. Will asked me today how I came to be here, she said. What did you tell him? The truth, she said, that I came looking for work and found you. He was quiet for a moment then, and what did he say? He said he was glad. Phineas tightened his arm around her. She felt the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing against her side and the warmth of him against the evening chill and the absolute sureness, as fundamental as the ground beneath the porch, as real as the creek and the hills, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. So am I, he said. Every day, she closed her eyes. The stars wheeled above the Cooper ranch in their ancient and indifferent beauty, and somewhere in the hills a nighthawk called, and the creek ran, and the sweet peas moved in the evening wind, and here on this porch in the last light of a summer Sunday evening, everything was complete.